Cooper could be that doggy.
Call to order the meeting of the Verona Plan Commission on Monday, October 7th at 6:30 p.m. We will start with the roll.
Commissioner Tucker Long. Commissioner Manley. Here. Commissioner Bear. Here. Mayor Diaz.
Here.
Alderperson Gaskell.
Here.
Commissioner Lytle.
Here.
Commissioner Heinzen.
Here.
Next up, we have the item 3, approval of the minutes from the September 3rd, 2019 Plan Commission meeting. Questions, comments, motions? Commissioner Bear.
Move to approve.
Motion by Commissioner Bear. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Alder Gaskell. Last chance for corrections. Seeing none. All those in favor of approving the minutes from the September 3rd, 2019 Plan Commission meeting, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The minutes are approved. Next, we'll move on to item 4. And before we get into the public hearing regarding the reconfirmation adoption of the City of Verona's existing comprehensive plan, which includes plans for transportation, utilities, and community facilities, natural and cultural resources, agriculture and economic development, intergovernmental cooperation, land use and implementation. If Mr. Sayer could give us a brief overview.
Yes, so this is a reconfirmation and reapproval of our existing comp plan. Our existing comp plan was adopted in 2009. That was when the state actually passed a law that, in short, required every municipality to adopt a comprehensive plan by 2010. So we adopted ours in 2009, and what the statute says is it should be updated with every 10 years. That's just a general kind of planning practice to have these updated approximately every 10 years. What staff is looking to do is we're looking to reconfirm our current plan and then wait until the 2020 census is completed. And the reason for that is we want to get on a better cycle for our data. Right now, if we would do it now, we'd be using ACS data, which is done, I think, every 5 years, and it's notorious for having a larger margin of error than your 2020 census data. So what we're looking for tonight is just a reconfirmation and adoption of the existing plan, and that includes all the neighborhood plans that we have done as well, which is a Southwest plan, Southeast plan, Downtown Mobility Plan, North Neighborhood Plan, the Outdoor Rec Plan, and then Northwest Plan, and just reconfirm those and then do the full comp plan rewrite when that census data comes out. We anticipate that to come out probably in the 2022 range. It really depends on just the release dates of that, but that's what we're looking for tonight, though, is kind of the reauthorization to recognize that we're reapproving our plan, but then also recognizing that we're going to redo it in the next couple of years, but we just need that data to come in. So as part of this, there is a public hearing component and requirements as part of the comprehensive planning law, which is in state statutes. The public hearing is required to provide kind of feedback and comments from the public. The Plan Commission then adopts a resolution, and then this comes actually forward to the Common Council as well for adoption too. So it does require a public hearing, which we're in right now.
Or just about to be. I move to open the public hearing regarding this topic. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Tucker Long. All those in favor of opening the public hearing, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. And at 6:33 p.m. we are open for a public hearing regarding this topic. I don't think anyone is going to speak on it. Going once, twice. Motion to close the public hearing would be in order.
So moved.
Motion by Commissioner Manley. Is there a second? Second by Commissioner Tucker Long. All those in favor of closing the public hearing, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. And at 6:34, the public hearing is closed. Mr. Sayer.
Yeah, I have nothing else to add on this topic. Once again, it's just reapproving, reconfirming what we have in place today. So that staff recommends the Plan Commission approve the resolution recommending the reconfirmation adoption and recommend to the Common Council the reconfirmation and adoption of the City of Verona Comprehensive Plan, including all the maps and descriptive materials contained within them. I'd be happy to answer any questions in the Plan Commission.
Questions or comments from the Plan Commission? Commissioner Lytle.
Thank you, Mayor. I know what our typical standards are for noticing a public hearing when it relates to a specific property. What expectations do they have for noticing a public hearing that pertains to the entire city?
Sure. So the statute requires a Class 1 notice, which means it goes in the paper one time at least 30 days in advance of the actual public hearing. As part of that, we do notify the adjacent municipalities like we do for all public hearings as well, but it's that 30-day requirement plus that one time in the paper notice.
I have Commissioner Bear?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just sort of curious about the timeline. The resolution language is somewhat ambiguous about after the census, but, sort of and I think that's okay, but what do we mean there? And when will it be back here? Is that 2022, 24? Sort of my understanding that some of that data takes longer than other to be released and available for public use. So what's the sort of general idea on timing?
Yeah, I don't have the exact dates in front of me. Off the top of my head, I think it's 2022 is approximately when that data will come out for the 2020 census. It takes typically a couple of years to compile it. A lot of that's the housing data, a lot of that's the demographic data as well. So I would anticipate probably in the next couple of years, it's going to be back before the Plan Commission to kind of kick off and start that conversation of redoing that comprehensive plan. I think the intent, at least right now, and this is looking off 2 years, we'd probably look at doing that plan in-house and not hire a consultant for it. But yeah, I would anticipate the next couple of years you're going to be seeing us again to start that conversation. But the reason it's ambiguous too is obviously the data is out of our control.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
As a follow-up to that, so if we wait to 2022, is there a risk of the plan getting out of date, of it getting stale and causing issues for the city?
Quite honestly, I think your current comprehensive plan, I think there's some challenges that are in there right now of it's too vague in some spots. I think our neighborhood plans, they're in pretty good shape, but I think the comprehensive plan, I don't kind of see it getting out of date in the sense of, and I say that partially because of it's in some areas lacking specific recommendations, which has made it challenging for staff to implement. I mean, one of the biggest challenges we have is we don't have an overall future land use map. That's one thing that's been lacking in that plan since day one, which has made our lives interesting and challenging at times when we come forward with projects. So I don't think it changes anything from what it is today. I think you run the risk of just not having some of that specifics in the plan, but it's no different than what we have right now. I think if we tried to go forward doing one right now, it's just we're going to be working off some challenging data that, and I'm especially looking at the housing and the income data, which I think is going to be a big topic of conversation when that goes forward regarding affordability and whatnot in the city. I just would really like to have the best data we can have available at that time. So I don't think it puts us behind in a bad spot. It's just we're stuck with what we have right now and status quo.
Gotcha. Other questions or comments from the Plan Commission? Ollie Gaskell?
Thanks. Adam, when we go to do this, will it be done in-house or is it going to be consultant-led?
I think as of right now, we're planning on in-house, but in 2 years, we'll see what comes in.
Questions, comments, motions? Commissioner Lytle?
I guess a little guidance on, are we approving a resolution at the Plan Commission level in anticipation of it being also approved by council? Or are we recommending approval of the resolution? What would you like us to do here?
So your motion, if you're looking at adopting the resolution, you make a motion to approve or adopt the resolution recommending the reconfirmation adoption and recommend the Common Council the reconfirmation adoption of the City of Verona Comprehensive Plan, including all maps and descriptive materials contained therein. So in the memo for this one, it has some general language you can kind of work off of for that. But you are adopting a resolution, and as part of the adoption of that, it is a recommendation to the council to adopt as well, too. And the resolution is required by statute also.
All right. Thank you. With that in mind, I'll make a motion that the Plan Commission approve the attached resolution recommending the reconfirmation adoption and as well as recommend to the Common Council the reconfirmation adoption of the City of Verona Comprehensive Plan, including all maps and descriptive materials contained therein.
Motion by Commissioner Lytle. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Bear. Anything to add, Commissioner Lytle? Motion before the body. Questions, comments on the motion? Commissioner Tucker Long? Is your mic on?
Do we need to add anything to that resolution about the data coming in and us looking at this again once the data comes in?
Nope, no, I think we're good. The minutes will reflect that.
Other questions or comments on the motion? Seeing none. All those in favor of the motion to have the Plan Commission approve the attached resolution recommending the reconfirmation, adoption, and, sorry. All those in favor of the motion by Commissioner Lytle signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no? And that motion passes. Next, we'll move on to item 5, which is a public hearing regarding the review and approval of the proposed project plan, boundaries and creation of Tax Incremental District Number 10, City of Verona, Wisconsin, located at the southeast corner of Wayland Road and Liberty Drive. Before we go into the public hearing, if you give us a brief overview, Mr. Sayre.
Sure, this is a public hearing. This is required by state statute when we create a tax increment district. This would be for tax increment number 10, which is at the southeast corner of Wayland and the future extension of Liberty Drive. This would be for ACS. We approved their actual site plan at the Plan Commission, it was a month, 2 months ago, but it was recently approved by the Plan Commission, and this would be a TIF district for their project. And this is, would ultimately go to the Common Council, I believe, on the 28th for adoption.
Thank you. With that, I will move to open the public hearing regarding TID District 10, or TID number 10, I should say. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Tucker-Long. All those in favor of opening the public hearing signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. We're in the public hearing on this topic at 6:42 p.m. So if anyone from the public wishes to speak, now would be the time to do so. All right. Yeah, quiet. I'm sure we'll have a longer meeting in the future to make up for this. With that, a motion to close the public hearing would be in order. Motion by Commissioner Manley. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Tucker-Long. All those in favor of closing the public hearing signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The public hearing is closed at 6:42 p.m. Anything to add, Mr. Sayre?
One to add is we have Greg Johnson here from Ellers. I'm not sure if you can say a few words tonight, Greg, about the TIF.
Good evening. Just to give you a quick orientation of the purpose of this TIF district, as was mentioned, this is for the ACS project. This will be an industrial TIF district, which by statute means it's suitable and zoned for industrial development. It'll have a maximum life of 20 years. This is an overlay district. All that means is that the property is presently within an existing district, but it is going to have its own boundaries and have its own maximum life from this point going forward. The property presently is within TID District number 6, which is projected to close in 2021. So to take advantage of a new life of a TIF district, you're eligible under statutes to create an overlay district. So the district will only consist of this particular development. In terms of the project costs that were identified in the project plan, really three categories of project costs. First is a development incentive, which is anticipated to be provided on what we call a pay-as-you-go basis, meaning that the development incentive will be paid from increment generated from that project on an annual basis. There's also some costs identified for contributions to future traffic signal improvements. And then there's also an allowance for general administrative costs of the district, annual audits, some staff time and reporting that's required to the Department of Revenue. In terms of the estimated taxable value from this development, it's about a 47,500 square foot building. We've estimated the value based on conversations with the city assessor at about $82 per square foot. So that results in about $3.9 million of increment value generated. Over a 20-year life of an industrial TID district, that would generate approximately $1.5 million of increment value. So in terms of just the overall performance of the district, we anticipate the first expense would be the payment of the development incentive that would be formalized through a development agreement that would be paid out annually from the increment generated from the project. covering the city's administrative costs related to the district, and then any residual revenue that's available from increment after those two expenses are paid would go to help pay for future debt service that could be incurred for the traffic signal improvements. So at this time, we're anticipating that the district would remain open for its full 20-year life, which would be in 2041, which is when closure would occur. So in terms of the process, as has been mentioned, you just conducted the public hearing, which is required by statute. There's a resolution that's on your agenda that's also required for adoption by the Plan Commission. If you choose to approve the resolution, as mentioned, it goes to the Common Council on October 28th. If it's passed by the Common Council, it's scheduled to go back to the Joint Review Board for final consideration on November 5th. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have on the district.
Any questions on the district? I think you can get off easy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess I'll just say I think it's great to see the jobs be added to the city. Any questions, comments, or motions from the Planning Commission? Commissioner Lytle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Adam, can you refresh my memory as to what the original tax increment District 6 was formed to cover in terms of infrastructure and that kind of thing?
Sure. So I don't have the details exactly what the purpose was. I mean, it was created around the year 2000, and the intent was it was an industrial TID. So as part of that, we have funded portions of Liberty Drive of that road. We've also funded development incentives for Wisconsin Brewing Company, I believe Latitude, Millipore Sigma, United Vaccines is also in that TIF district as well. So it has kind of functioned on twofold, from a development incentive standpoint, but then also from a public infrastructure standpoint of incentives that provided. The exact purpose, like I said, don't know, but it's a typical industrial TID where you have an industrial business park and you're looking to create jobs and create businesses or establish businesses.
So the original borders of the district extended north of Highway M? I didn't think we even knew anything was going to be happening north of Highway M at that point.
Yeah, so on the screen before you, this is part of the actual district. So the purple area is the existing TID 6. That is the area that's north of M. It does extend south into the Verona Technology Park, the current park, which includes Latitude, Millipore Sigma, United Vaccines, and whatnot. So it included a very large area, but it did also include portions of actually all of Liberty Business Park.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments or motions? Commissioner Manley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm excited about this project, and I guess the only question I have, and it's really not necessarily germane to whether or not we approve this resolution, but I think I just wanted to ask staff, I think it's fair to say that in the past when we've done TIF developments and some of the development agreements in Liberty Business Park and the Technology Park come to mind, we typically require the developer or the person receiving assistance to, as part of the development agreement, guarantee a minimum amount of increment, such that if for some reason the project, the assessed value fell short of the increment value that we're assuming in the table in the staff report, the property owner or the developer, whoever is the party to the agreement, would have to make up that shortfall if the value was less than that. That's correct, and assuming that the answer is yes, we would likely pursue the same type of development agreement for this property as well.
Correct. So we do have that in the development agreement. That would have to go to the Common Council. It will be going to Common Council on the 28th. That agreement includes language similar to what you're talking about. It does require a minimum investment on the behalf of the company to locate there. They need to prove they've actually invested the dollars that they're committing to. And for some reason, if they fall short of that, the incentive would be reduced based upon the percentage that they're falling short of it. So, for example, if this is just examples. If they're saying they're going to put 10 million in and they hit 9 million, then it would be reduced by 10% based upon that. So this is the incentive we're doing here is a pay-go TIF incentive. So it'd be we're only paying out kind of the portion of the taxes, so we're not borrowing the money up front, so that there's very little risk to the city. But we do have those kind of protections in place, just a slightly different format because it's a pay-go versus a upfront borrow incentive that we have done before. But we're going to be set on that too. We'll be in good shape.
Thank you. And I think it's important to point that out because TIF is really one of the only real meaningful economic development tools that local governments have. And there have been criticisms, perhaps some of them valid, in some communities that have had TIFs that have failed or, haven't, they had a shortfall in revenue. And I think it's important that people understand with this particular project and others that the city has done, and our TIF performance has been pretty phenomenal in Verona, that there is very little, if not no risk that, to taxpayers as a whole. So it's really, I think, a great opportunity to attract a business, to attract development, to attract jobs to our city, and taxpayers are protected. So I'm very happy about supporting this particular item tonight.
Other Commissioner Manley?
I'll go ahead and I'll make the motion that the Plan Commission approve Resolution PC-19-02, designating proposed boundaries and approving a project plan for the tax incremental district number 10 in the city of Verona.
Motion by Commissioner Manley. Is there a second? Seconded by Alder Gaskell. Anything to add, Commissioner Manley?
No, thank you.
Motion before the body. Questions, comments on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. And that motion passes. Next, we'll move on to item 6, which is discussion and possible action regarding the zoning and sign code rewrite, which consists of introducing the consultants, reviewing information from the questionnaire, reviewing feedback from the workshops, and discussing an overview of the rewrite process.
Jackie, aim that so I can see what's on it. All right, Mr. Mayor, Plan Commission members, council member, thank you so much for having us here. My name's John Houseal with Houseal Levine Associates. With me is Jackie Wells from our office, and we are going to be assisting Verona as it seeks to update its zoning ordinance and sign ordinance over the next year or so. This is just the kickoff of what's going to start to be a year-long project. Whenever we do this, we've spent the day, we held a commercial workshop, residential workshop, and a sign ordinance workshop. Only a few people showed up, not a lot, but we want to give people the opportunity. Unlike planning, zoning, people typically don't come out of the woodwork until you propose something, and then they look at it. But we always like to get the opportunity up front. We had some good conversations with some developers earlier today to find out what they thought was or was not working with the code. So one of the key reasons we do when we start this is to make sure we're chatting with the Plan Commission, because you are sort of on the front lines, if you will, of implementing the zoning ordinance project by project, phase by phase. You have firsthand knowledge as to what works, what may not work well, and things that you would like to see potentially changed as we attempt to, as we rewrite the zoning ordinance from cradle to grave. So what I want to do is go through a pretty brief presentation, very brief, sort of what a zoning ordinance is, what it should be, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and then tee up a few questions for you to think about. Then we can get into, Mr. Mayor, a discussion as to what you think are some of the issues that we need to begin to address as we start this project. So with that, I'm actually going to track this on 2 different devices because that one won't reach over here. So the first one is why are we here? Is that right? Yep. So again, we're here to rewrite the entire zoning ordinance from beginning to end. Zoning ordinance, what it is it really is the rules, the law by which governs what you can use your property for and what comes out of the ground, I mean, in a nutshell. But it's a tool used to enforce city policy. It permits or restricts certain uses. It regulates the look and feel of an area. It really gets to get at the character of an area, the intensity of an area. It controls residential density and commercial intensity, and it promotes the public health, safety, and welfare. What it really does is it provides fair certainty. It gives reasonable expectation as to what you can do with your property and a reasonable expectation as to what your neighbor can do with their property because they're next to yours, and that matters. It governs the procedures by which development gets approved and as of right development is permitted to take place. So it's very, very important piece of property, or very important piece of legislation, if you will, for the city to have in place. Why does it need to be updated? This is straight from your RFP. So these are things that the city recognizes as some of the issues, and we've noted some already working with staff and some of our own observations. It hasn't been completely updated since 1996. That's not uncommon. Zoning tends to lag behind planning as a regulatory tool. And make no mistakes, zoning is not planning. It's not. Zoning is a tool to implement planning objectives. All right, that's it. But zoning is not planning. You use it to implement planning objectives. But it hasn't been updated in a long time holistically, and we need to do that as opposed to just reacting to stuff. Contains standards that are outdated, difficult to administer, and often hidden in many different sections. In general, you have a very cumbersome code. It is challenging to navigate. It is difficult to find out sometimes the regulations which govern a piece of property and in what manner. Adam talked about some of the vagueness that exists in your comprehensive plan. There is some consistency and vagueness carried over to your zoning ordinance that we need to address. There are missing sustainability features or sustainable features. As codes become more and more outdated, there are best practices that become commonplace that codes do not incorporate. Sustainable best practices, alternative energy sources, permeable paving surface treatments, conservation design protocols, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are things that are now much more commonplace. Older codes simply do not include them. So anytime a developer comes forward and tries to do what is the best practice nationally, your code doesn't reflect that, and so they need zoning relief to do it. And we need to sort of bring this up to more current specifications. It lacks options for mixed-use districts. It ought to do a better job in certain areas of the city to articulate the desire to see and accommodate mixed-use development in a more streamlined and predictable fashion, as opposed to developers running a flag up the flagpole to see what happens or having the city react to something. Almost all redevelopment is a PUD. There are pros and cons of this. The pros of this is you have more control over what gets built. You get to see every aspect of a development. Although your PUD process lacks some of the standards to give you guidance on how to evaluate plan developments, which is a challenge unto itself. Some of the downside is it can take 6 months to get a development approved, which could possibly be considered as of right in certain districts. If you could tighten up your landscape ordinance, your sign ordinance, your setback ordinance, your use standards and provisions, then someone could come in, pull a building permit, meet your code, and do building development as good as you're getting through the PUD process right now for some projects. So we need to take a hard look at what requires PUD triggering and an extensive public hearing process, 6 months or more in many cases, versus what we know can be done as of right as long as certain design protocols and standards are being met. So if we write those standards, if we write those design criteria into the ordinance and someone can meet all of them, they ought to be able to pull a building permit and simply build something. So we need to take a hard look at what is allowed as of right and what requires PUD, conditional use, or other sorts of things. It lacks specificity, making zoning enforcement pretty difficult. Some areas are not clearly written or stated. There shouldn't be a lot of ambiguity in a zoning ordinance. And a zoning ordinance, no offense to any attorney up there, you shouldn't need an attorney to interpret a zoning ordinance in most cases. If you are a developer or a resident or a business owner or a property owner looking to build out a tenant space, you should be able to look at a zoning ordinance, easily reference what you need, and clearly understand what you can and cannot do. And if you need relief, exactly what you have to do to get that relief, either approved or denied. But it needs a level of clarity that is right now lacking. It's not very user-friendly. You have different sections of the code that are contradictory to one another as a cross-reference document, and it lacks the graphics to improve its use. All of our zoning ordinances now are really sort of rich in graphics. Graphic communication is how we are all wired at this point in time with the advent of the internet and everything online. Things are no longer sort of these 3-ring binder bound books in the back of Adam's office on a shelf. This is stuff that lives and breathes on the internet. It needs to be visual, it needs to be clear, it needs to have concise, very accurate text that goes along and dovetails with really rich graphics, and our codes all do that, and your code will have that. And it's not compliant with state and federal statutes regarding some provisions of procedures, and with regards to signage, with regard to some aspects of signage. There's a new Supreme Court case called Reed v. Gilbert that basically made it unconstitutional to regulate signage based on content. And you have some sign aspects of your regulations that are predicated on regulating via content, and you can't have that anymore. So in order for that to have sort of legal bearing, we have to go back in and remove content-based regulations out of your sign ordinance. So even though I think right now your sign ordinance is delivering some pretty nice signage around town, you don't have the ugly pylon signs, you don't have the big pole signs up in the air, you don't have spinning graphics or crazy animation. Most of it is appropriately scaled, attractive monument signs. And it gives a real nice ambiance to the overall character of your commercial areas. But we have to go back in and remove any content-based regulations to make it complicit with the Supreme Court. So what will the new code do? It'll seek to regulate the norm, not the exception. You have to sort of write the zoning ordinance to hit that 95% mark. There's always going to be cases that simply don't work, and that's why you seek variations. You can write an ordinance that applies to 95% of residential properties. If I've got some weird diamond-shaped or triangular piece of property at the end of a ravine, I need to come in and get a variation because it just doesn't work. You don't write for the exception, you write for the norm. We have to make sure we do that. Provide a user-friendly, easy-to-navigate document. It's not a novel. People don't read it from cradle to grave, front cover to cover. They want to know what they can do with their property or how they navigate the approval process. They're going to use it as a reference document, go to the section they care about, read it, and they need to be able to get what they want and get out of it. So we have to make it much more user-friendly for everybody to use. Stay-at-home dad, a small business owner, a new developer should all be able to navigate this with real clarity. Make ordinances understandable by all. Again, this is not, you should not need a law degree or a land use degree or a technical writing degree to navigate a zoning ordinance. Clarify regulations with standards and graphics and tables. If we can say it with a picture that is 100% crystal clear, we don't need 4 pages of text. And if we can update the protocols with which we establish a use ordinance or use table, your use table does not have to be page after page after page after page after page of outdated uses being annotated. Streamline the development review process. We want to take a look at this. We have to take a look at how people seek plan unit development approval. Right now, from our understanding, there's not a whole lot of standards that are in place with which to guide your review and evaluation of a development. That's a huge problem. It should not be ambiguous, it should not be nebulous, it should not be entirely subjective. You should have standards of review with which you evaluate a development, and either development proposal meets or does not meet those standards of review. Your decisions are based off of that. That gives every developer a level of fair certainty, and the next guy through the door the same level of certainty as the guy that came through 6 months ago, and vice versa. And right now, some of your standards are lacking with regard to PUD process. We want to encourage new development and redevelopment. I think a municipality's job is to set the table for private investment that delivers desirable development in the community. Cities do not build restaurants, cities do not build multifamily, cities do not build entertainment installations. Private equity does that, private investment does that, private property does that, and developers do that. That doesn't mean you give them everything they want. It means you give them an ordinance that's fair and delivers high-quality product. They're the ones that make it work. So we have to make sure that it works for anybody who's seeking to do development and redevelopment, and again, in a manner that delivers what the city wants, not necessarily giving everything what the development community wants, but making it fair and equitable. And then support innovative approaches to land use regulations. There's a lot of new ways things are being done now. We're seeing trends across the country. We do zoning ordinances across the United States, and we're seeing some trends now that right now are not reflected in your zoning ordinance. What won't the code do? It's not planning policy. Again, planning comes first, zoning comes second. This will reflect what you hope to achieve as a community. This is not setting up policy. This is regulating policy you already have. Understanding that you are going to be redoing your comprehensive plan in a couple of years, let's say. One of the standards for review of a plan development is typically standard number 1 is your plan unit development complicit with and supportive of your comprehensive plan. So that ought to be standard number 1. Understanding that until your comprehensive plan gets redone, that might not be applicable. It should still be a standard, but an applicant can come up or staff could say in its report, right now standard 1 is not applicable, we're going to be redoing our comprehensive plan in 2 years. Once we have a new one on the books, this standard will be applicable. But we want to make sure that that it is a document that guides this, and the policy is already set. It won't accommodate every situation. That's why you have variations. It's why you have PUDs. Zoning will not accommodate everybody out of the box. That's why you have different situations for that. It will not prevent all nonconformities. Nonconformities exist both in terms of use, structure, and property. If it's legally established and the zoning ordinance changed, it's grandfathered in or legal nonconforming. If it was illegally established, it's just illegal. There's a difference. But we will have to accommodate a section of nonconformities, again, for uses, structures, and properties. And it will not eliminate the need for zoning relief. You can spend 2 years zeroing in and create the best zoning ordinance the world has ever seen. And the first guy that applies for something 2 weeks after it's adopted will need variation. So it's inevitable that relief is going to have to be sought at some point in time. So what's next in the process? This is the process that we're going to be following. So step 1 is a kickoff. That's today, and working with staff to begin our get our bearings. Step number 2 is a detailed diagnostic. This is where we go through and redline and rip apart your existing code. And anything that we think is a major shortcoming or a problem or something that we need to address, we will flag what it is, why it is, and what we think we need to do about it. It's sort of that initial cut at sort of, again, it's a diagnostic of your existing code. And we will be working on that with staff and on our own, and we will beta test it against some of the planning policy you have on the books to see if your zoning is actually delivering the community you say you want to get, or if it's happening without zoning's assistance. The next section will be done will be district standards. District standards for most people is what zoning is. What's my zoning? What can I do? What can't I do? And where does my building go and how big can it be? And that's district standards. So it's bulk regulations, height, lot coverage, FAR, setbacks, things like that, and use, what's permitted, not permitted, or conditional. Those are 3 different things. And so step number 3 is district standards. This is the different standards, use tables, and bulk regulations for all the different districts. Once we go through district standards, the next thing will be development standards. Development standards can best be thought of as standards of general applicability. They are not district specific. And what I mean by that is, if you have a parking lot, doesn't matter what commercial district it is, there are certain standards you have to follow. If you have a drive-through facility, it doesn't matter what district you're in, you have certain standards your drive-through facility has to maintain. If you're a commercial piece of property adjacent to a single-family district, you're going to have some landscaping or buffering treatment. It doesn't matter what district you're in, you're going to have some kind of landscaping treatment that is required. You're going to have some kind of landscaping within the perimeter and interior of your parking lot. It doesn't matter what district you're in. So these are standards of general applicability. They typically affect lighting, landscaping, and things that parking lot design, drive-throughs. These are things that may pop up anywhere in any district. We want to make sure they're always done well. So step number 4 is development standards or standards of general applicability. We'll also be taking a look as part of 4, your sign code as well. And again, I think Some sections of your ordinance will require some major revisions. Some sections will likely require just some minor touching. And I think, again, there are some things we know we have to address in signage from a legal perspective. And then again, it all goes back to the First Amendment. There's a lot of things in planning that have to be done because of the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Adult uses is one, signage is another one. So those are all governed under the First Amendment. Step number 5 will be administrative. These are the procedures through which things get accomplished. What are the procedures for conditional use applications? And what is the hearing protocol and the standards in place to review, approve, amend, or deny a conditional use application? Same thing for plan development, same thing for variations. This will govern notice requirements, application requirements, public hearing procedures, and what the steps are that a person goes from the time they sit down with staff to say, I'm interested in doing X, to getting ultimately approval or denial from City Council. And all the steps in between, everything that they have to do, everything the city is responsible for doing, and the process along the way. We have to make that very clear for everybody. And then after we get the administrative part done, and that will also include nonconformities, then we go into step number 6, which is to pull all of these sections together into the draft ordinance. But those are essentially the core components of what a zoning ordinance has to entail. So next I want to go through sort of a series of questions, and then I want to kick it over to you to think about any of these things, but I want to tee up some of these questions to think about. So are there specific aspects of the zoning or sign ordinance that you think are particularly unclear or difficult to understand? Again, you are sitting on that side of the dais from petitioners who are often here proposing something. So you're often aware of what you think works well, what doesn't, or if an applicant points or staff points to something in the code and you may disagree with what you think in terms of how that is interpreted. So are there areas of the code that you think are not clear, are difficult to understand even if you read it 5 times, or things that you think could make the code more user-friendly? So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about development standards. Are there specific development standards or land use regulations that have caused problems? And development standards, I'm talking about lighting, signage, landscaping, parking lots, the conditional use requirements for a drive-through facility, whether it's a bank, a pharmacy, a dry cleaning, or a restaurant. All should have different queuing space requirements or design requirements. Are there things right now that you think are lacking in your code in terms of the standards by which development takes place? Are there zoning issues unique to residential neighborhoods that need to be addressed? Maybe it's the home occupation standards. Maybe it's better standards to accommodate infill development that you're hearing from the building community or the Home Builders Association or something. And are there zoning issues specifically for commercial or industrial areas? Outdoor screening, commercial use, conditional uses, outdoor dining, whatever. Are there things in the commercial districts that you think we need to address? And then are there sort of the types of application, land use permits required by the city staff and plan commission that the current code provides for a level of review or application? Are the application procedures clear? Are the standards of review clear? When you are going on the record of approving or denying a PUD, do you have clear direction as to what you should be basing that decision on? So the next guy that comes through can't say, hey, you let Jim do it 6 months ago, and now you're denying mine. What standards are you using do you think you have the direction you need to make those decisions in an informed manner? And then are there any other issues that you think are out there for the zoning code? So there's use, there's design, there's process, there's development standards, there's clarity, user friendliness. There are a whole lot of things that the code has to address. And being on the Plan Commission, being City Council, Mayor, you know from what you hear often what does or does not work well from your perspective. So that's a quick overview of why we're doing this, how we're going to be going through this over the next year. And at this point, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to turn it over to you and anybody at the dais to just begin a discussion as to some of the things that they want us to be aware of that they think is a problem. So, thank you.
Questions, comments? Alder Gasco?
One thing I think would be really helpful is no matter what information ends up in there, right now when you go to search something, you either get 400 instances of the word and you don't find what you're looking for, or it's buried so far underneath that I end up having to email Adam for him to find it. It's something simple as like a porch railing for code around porch railings. So however we get the information, when we go to post it online, having it maybe the index be more comprehensive, or an easy way for people to find stuff without having to sift through everything would be great. I also would love some more creative tools. I feel like our zoning is zoning. It's pretty boring. There's nothing interesting or there's no Verona stamp on it,
Right.
whatever that might be. But if we're going to incorporate some sustainability options, that might be a way to start to curate it so it's a little bit more specific to what we might want to do as a community.
I like that term Verona stamp. I think if you look at the outcome, a lot of your plan developments that you eventually get to through that process, I think you can see the Verona stamp as you drive around town. You really get that sense of character. And if we could find a way to establish those as design standards for as-of-right development as well, I think then you're really onto something. And your idea of sort of hyperlinks or cross-referencing within the document is an essential. That's how people reference stuff, and this is a reference document. So I couldn't agree more, yeah.
Other questions, comments from the Plan Commission? Commissioner Manley?
I think, from my perspective, we have maybe too many different zoning classifications. I think of, and they're not necessarily intuitive, at least they're not to me. You've got, neighborhood residential and community residential. What do either of those mean? Like, commercial, institutional, commercial, there's just a lot of different classifications. And I think if we can streamline that and make them a little bit more intuitive, I think that would be helpful. I think we have some zoning classifications that carry some significant prescriptions along with them that actually end up driving up the cost of development, and particularly in the residential area of the zoning code. And I think that there's a lot of probably different ways to define what affordable housing means or how you achieve affordable housing. But I think if we start before you even move the first shovel of dirt, make property more expensive because of the zoning requirements, that's something that I think we should try to avoid if possible. And there was one other. Between the I can't even. I think I started on the Plan Commission in like 2006 or 7 or something like that. And then I had to leave when I was on the city council, and now I'm back on it, and I love it. But I think for my entire time of serving on either the city council or the Plan Commission, we've never reviewed a zoning variance in the way that a zoning board of appeals would. It seems like anytime anybody wants anything that doesn't fit within our zoning codes, it's a PUD process.
Right.
And it seems like there should be a way to review variances without having to go through that kind of a process.
Yeah, so we're kindred spirits then, because you said a lot, and I agree with everything you said. So let me sort of run through some of it, see if I can unpack it. The affordable housing thing is very much, again, it's a policy thing, and even more than it is a regulatory thing. But there is a direct correlation between the cost of property, the cost of development, and your ability to bring affordable units online. Define affordable even as lower economic level, but still market rate housing. We're not talking subsidized, we're talking still just more affordable market rate housing. The more expensive development is, the harder it is to do that. You may need, if there's not a financial incentive to bring to bear, then you're looking at density, height, or other things to allow things to be more affordable, because you can only combat real estate value with density as a means to get more units for the same price. And so there's a lot in there. Your issue with regard to sort of plan developments and variations, couldn't agree more. I've not seen, and we talked a little bit about staff, I've not seen, and again, there's no one way only to do things. So I'm not saying yours is the wrong way or the right way. It's something we need to consider. But I've not seen a setback, failing to meet a setback is grounds for triggering a PUD. That's a new one for me. I think there are things where you need to be able to just say, I need a variation for this or that. I don't need a whole PUD. I just need a variation for something pretty straightforward. The zoning board typically is more active in communities, the zoning board of appeals, than the PUD docket for the plan commission, because there are things that can be, relief can be granted fairly simply. The biggest caveat difference between a PUD for not meeting a standard and a variation procedurally and legally is you can seek relief from the zoning ordinance via PUD because you want to do a better development. There may not be a hardship. You might want to move the building 10 feet closer to the property line than you should because you think it'd be a better development. There's no hardship or why you have to. Variation has the test of a hardship. If I come in here and seek a hardship for something, saying, listen, and I'll go back to an example, we write the zoning ordinance that says you need a 15-foot setback for a residential piece of property at 22,000 square feet. That works for 95% of properties, but I've got a trapezoidal-shaped property on the top of a ravine where 2/3 of my property is got a steep slope. So in order to get anything legit out of my addition, I've got to move it over a little bit closer than I would otherwise because I've got a ravine. If you have a physical property condition that distinguishes your property from other similarly zoned properties in the same district, that's grounds for a variation. But if you have a rectangular piece of property that's 25,000 square feet, when it has to only be 22,000 square feet, it's perfectly rectangular, but you want a house so big it's going to be 5 feet from the property line, there's no hardship. You just want a bigger house. That's not a hardship. It's an inconvenience. And if you don't meet the test of hardship, you should not be getting a variation. If you seek grounds for planned development, you don't have the test of a hardship. So there's legal differences. We have to sort of sort that out as well. But a PUD process should not be the means to which variations are sought. That's just a fact. So I agree 100%.
Other questions or comments from the Planning Commission? Commissioner Bear.
I was, struck by at least two things that you said. One being encouraging new development and redevelopment with a zoning rewrite to accommodate things that we would find, I think you said, desirable.
Mm-hmm.
How do we figure out what it is we think is desirable? Is that part of this process?
Yeah, we were not going to be able to go back and revisit all the policy questions that that's what planning is for.
Right.
But we now have neighborhood plans and other special area plans. We have an antiquated comprehensive plan, but my guess is we can still glean something out of there in terms of character or intent. We can also look at the track record of things that have come out of the PUD to see a very clear trend in what is and is not getting approved and why.
Right.
So there's some precedent that is being set there that we can take a look at. I understand the idea of having more things than not go through the PUD process. It allows you to look at stuff you otherwise would not get allowed to look at. You look at building material and architecture and signage and all sorts of stuff. And if someone comes in and says, hey, we meet the conditions A, B, C, and D, we're going to build a polling permit and go, you don't get to review that stuff. Mm-hmm. That's okay in a lot of situations, but in some situations you want that scrutiny, you want the PUD. But what is the balancing act between what you should just allow if they meet the standards versus something that triggers the need for a PUD in a public hearing? We have to figure out what that balance is. And I think going back then to Mr. Manley's question about the number of districts, it's one of the things we always look at. We are wrapping up a zoning ordinance in a community in Missouri. We won from 18 districts to 9. We did one in Muskogee, Oklahoma years and years ago, where same meeting in front of the Plan Commission, and he's like, are you going to be looking at the number of districts we have? And I said, oh, absolutely. And this Plan Commissioner member goes, that's good, because he goes, I can think of at least 4 more that we need. And I looked at him and I said, well, you got 29 now. I was thinking of taking about 10 out. And he just laughed, and he asked why. So I explained why. We ended up limiting it from 28 down to 18. So we will examine the zoning district structure. We will examine what the intent is of the different districts and why the regulations are written the way they are for those different districts. In some cases, we leave the same number in place. Sometimes we merge or collapse. And in some places, to better accommodate, like, say, mixed-use development, we may create a new one. Don't know yet. But we will be examining districts. And the first question you need to ask when you look at zoning is the question almost nobody asks. And that is, why are we doing it? So if you're writing a mixed-use district, you're saying, what do we hope to accomplish here? What are we trying to accomplish? Well, we want development that does this, this, and this. Okay, with that, I can write you a code. But first you have to step back and say, what is it we're trying to accomplish in these different districts? And if you don't need 5 districts to do the work of 2, you do 2. And if you need 2 more because you're not getting what you want, you create 2 new ones. But the first question is why, people too quickly get into like, should it be 15-foot setback or 12-foot setback? I like 18-foot setback. What about a variable ratio setback? And I'm like, what are you trying to accomplish? I mean, we can talk numbers all day long. What are we trying to do here? Well, we want to prevent this. That's easy. Here's how we do it. So we need to focus on what we're doing and why, and the numbers will come. So I don't know how many districts we'll end up with, but it'll be the right number. And if we can collapse, we'll collapse. If we need to create, we'll create. Don't know yet. So.
Well, so I guess I'm curious if we think we have sort of a clear enough vision for what we think would be a desirable result of this to give you sort of a good enough idea of where to go with this.
My sense of it is yes. And like I said, your comprehensive plan is a little bit long in the tooth, but that's okay. We can see the development that has recently been being approved and coming out of the ground, so we get a sense of the character. Again, you've got some of the other special area plans that have been done since the comprehensive plan has been done. And we'll have the benefit of staff, the Plan Commission, and Council as we go through this to make sure we're doing it right. And in a perfect world, you do the comprehensive plan first, and you do zoning second. But the timing sometimes just doesn't work out. And you've got a situation right now where you've got a lot of growth happening, and you want to get those trajectory numbers correct. And if you have to have a planning document, it has to be predicated on market realities, because otherwise it's not visioning, it's hallucinating. You have no idea what you're throwing a dart at. So we need to wait for those census numbers to come through in a couple of years to project out for the next 10 to 20. Otherwise, we're using 10-year-old data, 12-year-old data. Can't do that. But we also don't want to wait for the zoning. So we can get this right, and even if we get it 98% right, and have to go back and tweak a couple things after the comp plan comes online in 2 or 3 years, big deal. Then you make a few changes and amend it.
Yeah.
But we got to get this in place, and I think we have the footing to do that very well. Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Then, so just one sort of very more, or perhaps more specific thing that we, I think, have several things, partly because of some of the problems in the zoning code that are more done by precedent, things like underground parking requirements that, so do all of those things that you made the point about, well, Jim got that thing last month, so why can't I get it this month? So will all of that sort of be wrapped into
Yes.
the final product and will not trample on those precedents? And likewise, the new code, so the new code wouldn't trample on those precedents, but likewise, those precedents would also sort of become the new code.
Yeah, so we'll look at what is not, in addition to looking at your code now, we'll also look at sort of standard practice now. Like, I found out about the 1 parking space per unit underground. That's a new one for me. I've not heard that. And again, we do zoning all over the place. So do we want to codify that standard or put in standards that maybe make a little bit more sense in different areas? No judgment, I'm just saying.
Well, we needed you maybe about 5-6 months ago.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
And the other reason why, and again, the other reason I think we need to do this is, it goes back to that notion of fair certainty. Zoning and variations in PUD, it's kind of like case law, not exactly, but there's precedent that's being set. Now, that said, any PUD and variation is judged on the merits of its individual particular case, not based on something that might have been approved previously for another site, because there are nuanced differences that can make a world of difference in decision making.
Right.
So it's a dead set precedent. That said, if you don't have clear standards through which to follow and evaluate, it's a little bit arbitrary. And all it takes is upsetting the wrong developer in the wrong way that feels as though he was sort of torpedoed a little bit and didn't have a sense of fair certainty or fair play, even with the best of intentions, schmentions, he's going to sue, she's going to sue, whatever, and nothing is more challenging for an elected appointed official or staff to be on a position or in a deposition trying to articulate why a decision was made when there aren't the protocols in place to help guide that decision. That is a really challenging, difficult place you do not want to find yourself. And with as much development as you're getting, with as much development as you're going to be getting in the next 10 to 20 years, if we don't clean up that procedural component of your code with standards and processes that are applicable to everybody, that's where you're going to end up. It's just right now it's too volatile a situation with the ambiguity that currently exists.
Right.
And the parking is one of them.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and I think you've
bet.
well justified the contract that you've gotten to do this work, so thank you.
Alder Gaskell?
This is more of an experience question for you. So related to what we're talking about with parking, have you seen in your experience I envision a checklist where we have a baseline of codes and ordinances that you need to hit as a developer, but then we have an A and a B and a C column, and you can mix and match, i.e., you can have one less parking spot if you give us 10% more landscaping. Is there room for the fluidity in here, or does that go fly in the face of what you just said about making sure that we as a city are protecting ourselves from lawsuits because we like a certain project more and can find a way to do what we want to do for that developer
Right.
versus
Right.
other developers?
Even with strict standards, fluidity can be built in, and I think it's a good thing. Your underlying standards, to me, though, are your baseline for where you start. And what I mean by that is, we're working in some communities that every time they approve a PUD, it's its own district. And I could never really understand that, because if the development were to go away, there's no underlying zoning guiding anything. And that's a challenge. When you have a planned unit development, if you come in and say, we want B2 zoning, but we're going to do this, we want a PUD in the B2 district. The baseline metric ought to be like, here's our parking requirements in the B2 district, we want to deviate by this many, here's why. They can make their case, but they've got to make it from the baseline standard that is applicable to everybody. Our setbacks are, 30 feet, we want to go to 25 feet, here's why. The building would look better here, here, and here. And you might say, well, we'll let you move 10 feet closer, but you really got to beef up your landscaping there beyond what the ordinance says, because you're closer to the neighboring properties. So we want to see enhanced landscaping. So the underlying zoning standards would be the baseline, through which a developer, and the onus is always on the applicant, to make their case as to why relief should be granted, to justify that, and to say what they're going to do in return for getting that relief. So there's always going to be baseline standards, there has to be, but there's always going to be the intent of a more creative component to allow flexibility in design. That's what a PUD is, strictly. A PUD is you define a geographic area, usually it's a property or properties, within which you establish a more creative approach to development. And you are able to get a development better than could be generated through the strict adherence of underlying zoning regulations. But if you have a more creative approach and allow a little bit of massaging, a little give and take, you can get a development that's infinitely better. But if someone were to come in on a small piece of property and say, listen, I've met all your new high standards, give me a building permit, you should just give them a building permit, all right? But a bigger, more complex development, or somebody who wants the creativity and applies for a PUD, then that creativity should be mixed into the process. So you'll be able to do both. Higher standards with more articulated development standards, but a process that accommodates that flexibility and creativity. You can do both.
Okay. This is maybe a question for you, Adam. What standards, ordinances are we held to the state standard? Like we can't design above and beyond that. Is that for stormwater, right? I'm thinking of every time someone comes with a plan of stormwater and they're always saying we've designed to the standards and we try to push for a little bit more, but we can't. There's nothing to back that up to hold them to that, right?
Yeah, there's stormwater standards established by the state. There's also standards in the, for conditional use permits now with the state as well. There's some changes in state statute there. There's a variety of nuances as it kind of comes down to these specific uses and whatnot. And, it's part of the reason why, we have, there's a law firm as well as part of this that'll be reviewing it as well to make sure we're in conformance with state statute as well. But there's a variety out there, and some have come out regarding cell towers, some have come out regarding wireless facilities. I mean, there's a variety of things out there that, especially over the last 10 years, have kind of been tweaked by the state. So there's some of those. Getting into setbacks, the only setback one I know of is from the ordinary high water mark, when you're talking like lakes, rivers, streams, and whatnot. Typically, a lot of those other standards are up to us, though, when it comes to just how buildings look. We have a lot of discretion in that. You get more into the process part of how much time can you look at something. When the application starts into the ultimate recommendation from a body, that's usually when those standards get triggered, especially in this procedures, making sure that we're not holding up a review or approval. And that's something that would just be built into the procedure section of it. But we do have a lot of flexibility, but there are some nuances in statute that they'll have to work through and they're aware of. But generally, we have a lot of flexibility, though, when it comes to setbacks and how you want your community to look.
Right. It's usually strict life safety stuff. It is often freedom of speech or First, Fifth, or 14th Amendment stuff, which is due process, takings, and freedom of speech. So the First, Fifth, and 14th Amendment, life safety. I'm trying to think of what the next one is. Or it's necessary infrastructure, like the Federal Telecommunications Act. was passed because when cell towers first came out 25 years ago, you'd go to a public hearing, they're going to put a cell tower out in a cornfield somewhere, and you'd get 300 people at a city hall saying it's going to give their kids cancer because they live 3.5 miles away from the cell tower. And cities were denying cell towers. And the federal government came in and said, listen, you got enough. Federal Telecommunication Act, you can sort of guide where they go and sort of how the process is that gets them approved, but you cannot create a void in this network. This is necessary infrastructure like water, sewer, and roads. And if we don't have cell tower, our country's going to fall behind. Necessary infrastructure regulated by the federal government. You can play around the margins, but you got to approve this stuff. And they came in. Same thing with stormwater, flooding, other things. There's certain things that they say, this is a regional or state issue. It's not a local issue. Here's the standards of which you have to abide, and you're stuck with it. So,
Commissioner Lytle.
Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to give you the answers or input for the discussion points you were asking for. But what strikes me about this is how important the implementation, the administrative side of it is. If at the end of this process, somewhere, let's say 20 to 30% of parcels in the city both now have a legacy zoning district and a current zoning district, and how, you know, those uses by right or by condition are grandfathered, and when that grandfathering goes away, you know, I want to put a deck on my house, guess what? You've got a whole new set of zoning standards to comply with, versus I want to put a 600-foot addition on my house, and you have a new set of zoning standards too. And so, you know, getting your all's help in terms of here's a you know, a combination of communications and, you know, sort of best practices that other cities have come through to deal with that. Because, you know, however many different lots exist in the city, you know, a big majority of them, I have to imagine, are residential. And, you know, giving homeowners, landowners, some view as to what's changing and what's not for that.
yeah, no, I agree. It's to most people, zoning is, like I said, it's the districts. What's my property zone and what can I do with it? And how big can my building be? People who really are into zoning, you care about like landscape and signage. To me, the real meat on the bone is the administrative side, the procedural side. The number side we can get to, the design side we can get to, that's not a big deal. Takes a while to get to it and it's nuanced, but that's an easier thing to arrive at. If your processes and admin and enforcement doesn't work, I don't care what your setbacks are, and it's a real problem. And that's where the rubber meets the road for a resident. I buy a piece of property, I want to be able to invest in that property in a reasonable way, and if the code is such that it denies or thwarts property investment, then you got a problem with your code. And that's a challenging thing to do. So that, to me, that's the most important section. Yeah.
Other questions or comments from the Plan Commission?
All right.
I'll call it myself, I guess. I mean, most of the stuff on the slide, though, why does it need to be updated? That, I think that's the kind of stuff I want, especially with what Alder Gaskell said about putting a Verona stamp, which might maybe include more of an emphasis on underground parking than maybe you might be used to, and especially by way of sustainability. I think we can do a lot there, and I think we want to do a lot there. So I'm really looking forward to that. And just in general, some of the other comments from other commissioners about streamlining and simplifying things. You know, maybe we don't need as many different zoning areas and things like that. And if we could just kind of make it simple, and then people can know this is allowed, this is not allowed. Right. You know, this will get your thumbs up, this will get your thumbs down, just so it's clear to people, I think. Right. I think that would go a long way to improving things.
Yeah, good doesn't have to be complicated.
Right.
It might be harder to do simple, but it's better on the back. And what did Mark Twain say? I would have written a shorter story, but I didn't have enough time. It's harder to write concisely and well. It's easier to go on. So we want to be like Mark Twain. In some ways. I'd kill for his hair, but just saying.
Last chance for comments or questions, at least for today. All right, Commissioner Bear.
Commissioner Lytle said the word legacy, and I'm thinking about that word in a different way. That zoning, the legacy of zoning is not always so great. There has been a fairly bad history with exclusionary zoning in particular.
Talk to Austin.
Yeah, and Milwaukee and some places closer by. So how do we, think through not doing that, not,
Right.
building something that we, looking back 50 years from now, if we're lucky to be around, we may not be so proud of in terms of, economic integration,
Right.
racial integration, just not being snobbish about
Right.
what it is we want to become.
I think it's, and I don't mean this in a flippant manner, I think it's much easier now than it used to be. Most communities in the past, if you see these lack of equitable applications, regulations, weren't like, oh, look at what we inadvertently did for the last 50 years. It was done with intent in most places. Sometimes thinly veiled, sometimes not so thinly veiled, but most of the places that serve as examples of where that was done, it wasn't always by like, oops, it wasn't. And now it is a driver in the application of crafting such codes. Equity on all fronts is sort of a big driver of the planning profession at its root level now and has been for quite a long time. There's much more spotlight shined on even the unintended consequences of bad codes, to the point where now it's being preventatively prepared as opposed to like unintended consequences.
Good.
So we're hyper aware of it as a profession, we're hyper aware of it as a firm. We've written zoning for some of the most affluent communities in the United States by zip code, where a $2 million house is a tear down, not joking. Or they buy the $3 million house next door and rip it down so Johnny can have a big yard to play lacrosse in, or whatever. And we've also worked in some of the most economically impoverished cities in the United States, dramatically so, and everything in between. So it's something we are keenly and hyper aware of. If at any time you think inadvertently something is being considered or crafted or whatever that may have an unintended negative impact, then by all means immediately bring it up, because we want to avoid that. And we work very hard to do that, but we want to make sure we do it well. So,
Great.
so I'm glad it's on.
Yeah.
I'm glad it's on your radar screen.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I think your message on that is right on the money, and I hope that our implementation of it thereafter would
Right.
follow right along with the seeking.
Zoning should treat everybody the same.
Yeah.
I worked in a community once, I was the planning director, and it was just a fence ordinance, and a person did something they weren't supposed to do, and they come in, and they were a federal judge, and they were just as indignant as could be. And the mayor and city council, they all knew the guy pretty well, and they took the side of the building inspector who'd been at the city for forever. He's like, listen, I don't care if you're the president, the judge, the pope, I don't, you're just like, zoning treats everybody the same. And he was really aghast, and I thought it was a very joyous thing to witness at a public hearing. So we're pretty mindful of that. So.
Thank you.
I think that's a good note to end on. But last chance for questions?
So it'll be a good project. We're thrilled to have been selected. If at any point along the way you think there's anything that we should be aware of or that you think is an idea for consideration, let staff know. They will let us know. And together with your input, we'll be able to get through this process and produce a real nice code for the city. So I look forward to the opportunity. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next we will move on to item 7, which is reports and comments from the planning department. First up, cluster mailbox ordinance.
Thank you. I have a few updates. Cluster mailbox ordinance, that continues to work through the Public Works Committee. That will be coming back to the Plan Commission in some form. We haven't drafted anything yet, but one of the recommendations coming out of the committee was to try to establish some almost design standards for these cluster mailboxes to make sure they have a good look to it, that it's not just a bunch of mailboxes kind of sitting out in the middle of nowhere. So we're going to be drafting some kind of guidelines for that. So that may be coming back to the Plan Commission. I suspect it's going to be, just because it's more of a use and design regulation. But that may be back here at some point for a conversation. Updates on development projects, that was in your packet. I guess I'd be happy to answer any questions on that. And then also in the packet, we did include the construction schedule for the road improvements out at the new high school. So I know that was mentioned at the last meeting. So Catherine put that in the packet of what those improvements are, and then also the tentative timeline associated with those improvements. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions from the Plan Commission.
Alder Gaskell?
Regarding the road improvements, so May 2020 seems to be the farthest out date. Is that to give them a couple months grace time to finish this before school starts?
Boy, I think it's gonna be more than that. Yeah, I would say a couple of those on there. And you can jump into Carlo if you want, but I would say definitely Wildcat Way and maybe Woods Road, especially Stewart's Woods Road. That those might be beyond that May deadline, but this is the latest schedule that we've kind of had on it, at least what they've given out publicly as part of information
So
meetings.
this is their timeline?
Yeah, correct,
Okay.
yes.
All right,
yes.
because I think if we feel that this is ambitious, we should probably prepare people for that, because I have a hard time believing every single one of these projects is going to be done at the end of May. And I just don't want people to be like, yes, finally all the road construction is done, and then we're like, oh, well, sorry. I mean, everyone is fatigued with construction around here, so I'd rather not contribute to it with a false date if we can avoid it.
Amen to that. Are there questions or comments from the Planning Commission? Seeing none. Number 8, reports and comments from the Plan Commissioners. Anyone have a book report for us? Or anything else? All right, seeing none, we are... Yeah. Next up, we have item 9, adjournment. A motion to adjourn would be in order. Motion by Commissioner Tucker Long. Is there a second? Second. Second by Commissioner Bear. All those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye. 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 Opposed? Very eager. Opposed, no. And we are adjourned at 7:46 p.m. Thank you.